Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Candid Conversations with my CPA. Today I have Allison Benedict with us, the founder of Pause Consumption. She's coming to us from Arizona. She has a very interesting background, just coupled with her time with private companies as well as some larger public companies, and what she's up to now with Pause and where she's going with lounges. As we know, it's a hot topic in the industry. Where are we gonna, consume this product? We have bars, but we don't really have lounges in any meaningful ways yet. And so I think this is a good topic because I've gotten more reach outs about lounges, and so I think it was a good time to bring Allison on. So Allison, I'll let you introduce yourself and what you're up to.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I'm really excited for this conversation. Been working with pause consumption as, founded it 2 years ago. And even in that brief time, there's been a big change in the perspective around lounges. But coming with, 10 years of experience in the industry, holding a lot of different positions, it gives me a really good, perspective in this kind of new part of a new industry. So.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, on that note, tell us a little bit about just your backgrounds. How did you get into the cannabis industry? Did you do anything before this industry? And then how did you kind of work through your roles? Obviously, you have a pretty diverse background. It looks like you spent some time on extraction, procurement, product development. So can you just tell us a little bit about your journey through before the industry and getting into the industry and what brings us today professionally?
Yeah, it does feel like a lifetime ago, but I did, do things before the cannabis industry, kind of forgot about them a little bit, but I was actually an adjunct college professor. I taught introductory biology and also some food systems courses to mostly freshman students, which was really exciting. And I even did
Okay.
some, hands-on learning environments with some elementary age kids, bringing their classroom to life through gardening. And I really got into the industry because I was looking for a second job at the time. Although it's glamorous being a professor, it doesn't actually pay that well. And I was really passionate about the plant because of my own experience with it. I had
Okay.
found that it helped me personally when I was recovering from a serious back injury that I had in college. And it really helped me with my pain management through that time. And so, as a real believer in the plant and then seeing the industry as something very exciting and something that I wanted to personally support the advancement of, I jumped in with 2 feet as soon as I could here in the Arizona market. And just because of the background that I had from my education and my undergraduate and master's experience, that's how I got into extraction
Okay.
primarily. And so it was really great, like early days of not fully understanding, how to properly extract cannabis, how to make high quality extracts. I remember the transition that we made from like dark oils into gold oils, like through the
Yeah.
distillation process. And that was incredible. Like there's such a change in such a short period of time. And just took that type of experience, which also allowed me to develop products for the very first time. Got to support that company with developing a brand, and thinking about packaging and all the little details that go into keeping a product both high quality on the shelf, but also presentable and interesting to the consumer. And was really privileged to have the opportunity to then join other companies after that experience, still on the operations side. And that experience within operations, I kind of was in a position where they were asking me to make a lot of things, and I was like, I actually don't have what I need in order to make the stuff that you're asking me to make.
Yep.
And as a small company, they were like, okay, why don't you help us make sure we have everything that you need? And that's how I got into procurement primarily, and started really on the operations side. But as that company was more focused on retail and retail expansion, they asked me to then, you understand the product, you understand how to make this product, you can call out these suppliers and third party vendors on if their product really is what we're looking for on our shelves. And so that's how I got into the retail merchandising side and working with more, other operators, other producers, and bringing things into the shelf. have always been very data driven. So I used a lot of that perspective and that kind of operations procurement type experience to build, assortment planning, and had an incredible time doing that, taking, from a single state operation to operating in, 8+ states over only like a 12, 18-month period of time. So that was incredible. And that, because I had contact and I was working with almost every brand or every product company, I was at least, familiar with them during that period. I really got interested in the brand development side and what really
Yeah.
gets people to feel loyal to a brand, and to feel that connection. And so that's how I made the transition from supply chain into brand marketing, and product development, which was my most recent role outside of being a founder of my own company.
Nice, nice. We'll get to the pause consumption, but yeah, but I want to just unpack a little bit of that because you do have like a really solid background where it's so like natural too, where it's like, well, I was part of the extraction team. So most products start with oil unless it's flour. So, all
Yeah.
right, now we actually have this, a base, raw material to now make products. And then once you get into products, it's like, all right, now we can develop a brand around this product, but wait, we actually need packaging, we need inputs, we need labor, we need supply chains. So like, why don't I just
Yeah.
get into buying this? And then once you get into buying it for a single state operator, it's hard, like, which is, respect, that's a task. Now it's like, okay, like now, how do I set up these supply chains in multiple states? Because we can't just ship from one state to these other, new states. We want to have a sales footprint, the nature of the beast of the cannabis
Exactly.
industry is you're either getting the license, securing the real estate, and building out your own facility, or you're partnering with somebody who has already taken the time to secure the license, build out a real estate, and has capital to work with you. So, can you
Exactly.
talk just a little bit about that transition from purchasing for one state and then having to purchase for multiple states or make sure products get to retail stores in multiple states? And how do you set up those purchasing? Because as we all know, in the cannabis industry, there's no interstate commerce in the United States. So we got it.
Right.
Like, did you set up a team in each state to purchase, or did you be in one location and you just knew who the people were in the state? Like, how did it work just mechanically and then
Yeah.
just emotionally?
That great question. And I'm so excited to talk about this because it's one of my like favorite topics. I love building
Same,
systems
same.
and building teams. And doing it scalably and affordably, because you can't necessarily have a full team of what you need in one state, especially if you're growing really rapidly. And that experience might not even exist in that state if it's a brand new medical market, for example, which in a lot of cases
Thank
it
you.
was. So where do you
Yes.
get that talent from? And so the way that we built that team in particular when we were scaling so quickly is we had certain functions that were centralized, things like data management. So it seems kind of silly and easy to forget, but things that make your life easier is having reportable, easy, clean data. And so we
And
had
by
a
data, do you mean
systems
like
team.
financial data or operations
Both,
data?
all of it. It's all connected, really. And so, how do
It
you
is.
create through disparate systems? How do you create linked data points? And so, through a centralized systems team that managed the back end of all of these individual, sections of the business, because there is no one kind of operating system that is every state. Certain states even have required programs that you have to use, like MJ Freeway in Pennsylvania,
Yeah.
for example. And so,
Mhm.
what you can do is you can standardize how you create those systems, things like the nomenclature that you use, the tags that are on that data, that then when you export it out of that system and combine it with the other data from the other systems, you can scale that and report at an enterprise level very quickly and easily and efficiently and see trends, not just within a market, but across the business. And when you're talking about like internal products and brands, that becomes really important because, if something's working in one state but not another, you can make informed decisions about that. But it also allows you, when you're building it in the retail environment, to say, hey, we partner, because as you're growing, as your business is growing, other people's businesses are growing too. So you might partner with someone who's also showing up in that state and say, hey, this product's actually really working for our partnership in Arizona, but it's not working in Ohio. So what are we going to do? And how do we actually leverage the full scope of our relationship to make things work across state lines when you're not actually moving product across state lines, just
Yeah.
leveraging the relationship that you have with them, which is a really fun and fascinating part of supply chain. And then on the like non-medicated items, which I was a part of as well, like you can build true more standard systems of procurement. You can leverage buying power with packaging companies, create standardization in your packaging where you're only putting variable information at a state level on things like compliance labels or whatever, but your hard goods are all the same. So that way you can get better pricing very simply. And you also have more flexibility if things are moving more quickly in one place or another. You can shift that inventory because it isn't a medicated good. It's just a Mylar bag, for example. So that part was really fascinating. On the actual people side of what we did on the procurement end, we had regional teams. So on medicated buying for the stores, for example, we had like a West Coast, a Midwest, and a East Coast team. And that would have a manager that was there locally and buyers that were in that region, but they might cover multiple states. For example, if a lot of the people who are operating in Maryland are some of the same players that are operating in Pennsylvania or New Jersey, you can have a buyer that is managing those same relationships and just working at a store level. And then as you get more and more stores
Huh.
in a state, you might not have all of that inventory directly delivered to the store. You might bring it into a centralized warehousing facility that's under your control, and then you're pushing that inventory into the stores as they need it. And that was something that we shifted from early days direct to store deliveries versus moving into a centralized warehousing, and then you're managing the final mile delivery, if you will.
Which do you prefer? Because I've seen it both ways as far as like a centralized warehouse distribution center versus direct to store delivery from the facilities.
What I like about a centralized system when you're the right size is that it makes it really easy on the partner. They don't have to go to 16 or 20 different doors. They just need to take your full delivery to one location. And like from a paperwork for all of our accounting and finance partners, we have one purchase order, we have, one PO to pay. We don't have all of these smaller onesie twosie types of deliveries that require the same amount of paperwork and the same amount of checks and balances. So I like that. I think there's also certain levels of controls that you can have on the incoming product. You have a receiving team that knows what they're looking at. Is it accurate as far as what was being delivered? Is it the quality that we expect? Or should we be rejecting this order at point of delivery? After you've already accepted something, especially in a store environment, it's really hard to get it out of there and to
Yeah,
talk to
yeah,
the
yeah.
partner and say, hey, can you come pick up your stuff? It wasn't what we wanted. You're usually
How do you
stuck with
guys
that.
do receiving? Do you guys like obviously there's, yeah, to your point, there's the financial internal controls of if we bought 100, did we get 100? But then there's
Yep,
also the operational like I see like internal or qualitative assessments of like, all right, if we bought grade B, is it grade B or is this grade C? Or of these 100 units, do they look like they're all gonna operate perfectly? How do you
exactly.
guys, and then do you standardize, and I'm just thinking through like hardcore like receiving, say you have 2 dozen stores and you have a different person receiving product into those stores. Do you have a procurement person at each store? Is it there just one regional head manager that almost spot check the store's receiving product, or how do
No,
you
so that's a
control
great question. The procurement end is handled on one side, and then usually at a store level, you have a vault manager or an inventory manager, and they are the partner locally there to the procurement person. They're communicating saying, hey, here's what you're expected to deliver. The inventory manager who's there on site is actually a part of your supply chain team, and they're doing the receivables and doing the checks and balances, and they are trained in how to properly do that. And then they communicate any discrepancies back to procurement, and then the procurement individuals are managing that with the partner.
it? Man, this is badass. Because you worked for like a big enough company where these are broken out, like just thinking of some of these smaller operators that grew into a couple of stores, like your head of inventory is kind of your head of purchasing, but like we know like that's just not logical. It's like, well, you don't
No.
it doesn't work, and maybe it works
It's
to get
different skill
started.
sets, to be totally honest.
Yeah.
It's
It's like
really
there's just
different
whole
skills.
procurement teams where all they do is have vendor relationships and they know how to negotiate terms and they know how fast their packaging is turning over in their inventory and
Yep.
like this fucking skill set to be a supply chain manager. And so it's cannabis is just one of those. It's just yet another thing in cannabis where it's like we got into a lot of bad habits because we were a startup industry coming out of
Yeah.
prohibition. And this is one of those like things that it's like if we come from that world where it's like, well, yeah, you had procurement, they were buying it, and then because we wanted segregation of duties, a different team would receive it because otherwise, there's things would go wrong.
Exactly.
And in cannabis, they're like, what? You just want to hire a bunch of teams? Like we just don't have endless
No.
budgets. And it's like,
It's actually really protecting the company at the end of the day to have
yeah,
these
it makes more
segregations.
money.
Yeah, it really is. When I joined a single state operator and I was there to really build foundation for them in their supply
Mhm.
chain, the person who was doing the purchase orders was also the accounts payable person. And
They're
I
paying
was
themselves.
absolutely mind blown when I heard that. Thankfully, this individual was an absolute angel and there was no egregious behavior, but there could have been.
Yeah.
Very
Oh, yeah.
simply, very easily. Oh, yeah,
One
of course we
auditors,
ordered
this gets me
this.
all
Oh, of
jazzed
course
up,
we paid
Allison.
it to this
Yeah, of course
LLC
we
that I
paid.
own.
Yeah. They're in a database of clients where they're like, who is this person? And it's just like, no, that's another egregious one. And just for people listening, so we're not don't just nerd out so much, but it's like there's internal controls around who purchases the goods, is not the person who receives them. And then the biggest one is cash controls. Like if cash is
Mhm.
leaving the business, we never want the person paying cash also receiving the product because then they can have
Right.
the assets of the product and the assets of the cash. And so but this
Yeah.
is stuff that it happens prolific in the cannabis industry where your inventory manager, he's managing the cash, he's managing the relationships, he's paying it, he's buying it. And
Yep.
but obviously like the industry is maturing. A lot of these smaller companies, just for better or for worse, are either growing or getting consolidated with larger operations. Where to your point, when you have that corporate structure, you can have a centralized team that's doing some of the more centralized tasks, such as procurement, maybe driving sales, and then you'll have your local teams at the local levels supporting these corporate ones, but they're also part of a very specific team, and there's like a delineation for a reason.
Yeah.
Which is a good segue into pause consumption. Obviously, we could nerd out on large company operations. Like for a while, I could
For a
tell, but
long time.
yeah, yeah. Let's switch gears into pause consumption because, like I was saying, consumption lounges they're a hot topic now because it's the next evolution. Like we have bars are starting to sell hemp derived, THC beverages, and so we're already mingling the two. And so, all right, well, what about the other consumers of cannabis? And so lounges are going to become a thing, just like their cigar lounges. So, can you tell me just a little bit about pause consumption and what was the catalyst that made you want to start it?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the reason why I started Pause was because I saw a huge gap in the industry. After being in it for so long, I couldn't believe that the relationship with the consumer ended at the dispensary. That
Yeah,
was where we left the relationship. And there were so few ways to legally and meaningfully engage with the end consumer. And as I was thinking of it really from, even from a brand and product side, like there's nothing that would be more valuable than meeting your consumer with your product, especially when it is their first or one of the first few times that they're consuming. Then, how do you say, hey, this is my product. This is exactly what I want you to know about it. This is exactly how you should consume it. This is how you should expect to feel. And I'm going to be here with you when you have that experience. So that way I can guide you through it. So there was that part of it for me. But then there was also, like you were even saying, the evolution of the industry itself.
yeah,
Being in it for so long and seeing how much has changed, especially around, the stigma that's with the plant and people's acceptance of consumption. How do we add consumption lounges as part of the supply chain for all of this amazing infrastructure and all of these things that have already been built? How do we create more avenues and points of distribution to get the product into the consumer's hand? So for me, it was a great business opportunity to say, hey, we already have built these grows, we've already built these extraction facilities, we have brands and products. A lot of the states in the current environment do have an oversupply. So how do we create more points of distribution to get the product into the end consumer hands and give them more options? Because just having dispensaries is not enough. They're kind of intimidating for some people. They can give off, not necessarily the vibes that everyone's looking for. So let's give people more options.
Huh. Dispos aren't enough. I kind of like that mentality, actually. And to your point, like, it's just such interesting times to be alive, where it's like we have some markets where they're completely used to distro, retail stores, distribution centers. But then even if they are used to it, we have some that are, down in Chicago, Illinois. It's like going into an Apple store. But then I've also been to some, licensed retail stores in the UP and Oregon, visiting there where it's like practically going into somebody's house and they're like pulling concentrates out of a refrigerator. You're like,
Yeah.
this is lawless. But it's not. It's licensed. It's papered. And so to your point, there's this huge discrepancy between some of these retail outlets, and I don't want to be seen going into a liquor store every day if I want to have a beer with some. And also, I can't drink at a liquor store, so like, what am I gonna
Right.
just go there and go to my house? It's like, no, I want to like go watch the Packers at like a bar and restaurant with other Packer fans. There's already a smoke deck, and so it kind of like to your point, there isn't there is a need for this. And so I
Yeah.
find that very interesting, which kind of I have a just segues into my next question is just around consumption lounges, and then we'll kind of circle back into pause. But how do they drive revenue? Just in the sense of, I know some more successful lounges in the past that had a large food and beverage scene where that, they did good amounts, did many, many millions
Mhm.
of dollars in food and beverage sales. But they also allowed cannabis consumption on site and they also sold. So they had the retail license or consumption license. So what normally drives revenues at these consumption lounges? Is it the food and beverage? Is it the cannabis? Is there a
Yeah.
goal? What is kind of the split of revenue percentages at these?
It's a great question, and it really varies depending on the state and the regulations of that state. So, in places where you can, as a lounge, dispense the product and you can have food and beverage, the product itself is going to be your biggest profit driver. You still will
Okay.
get a lot of revenue from food and beverage, but as anyone in the restaurant industry knows, it's not necessarily high margin products like the cannabis goods will be. That's what's really important as we look at the evolution of lounges and lounge regulations is that in order for them to be successful, there's a couple things that need to be true. They need to be able to have per person allotments and dispense the product on site. They need to be able to offer non-infused and infused food and beverage there, as well as entertainment and other ways of creating revenue. So for lounges that can't dispense product and they can't have food and beverage, it's going to be very difficult to be successful. They're going to be really relying on event tickets, essentially selling table space or renting table space. And in the cases where they're doing, event structures and they're putting on, specific nights, they're going to look to plant touching partners for sponsoring those events. And that their revenue is actually going to come from the plant touching partners who are looking to get in front of the consumers that they have coming into the lounges.
All right. I just kind of had a chuckle at that because it's not a chuckle. It's the nature of the industry. Like, you just got to embrace that this is hard because everybody in cannabis is like, our margins are the worst. And it's like you just said, it's like, no, actually, if you compare it to food and beverage, cannabis actually has stronger margins than food and beverage and almost the entire restaurant industry as a whole. Yet here we lie.
Absolutely.
We have massive restaurant companies, regional restaurant companies, national restaurant companies, local restaurant companies, all making it work, multi-generational. So the cannabis business owners and operators listening to this, like, relax. Like, you don't have it as bad as restaurateurs. So if you want somebody to
Exactly.
listen to your complaints, maybe go talk to a restaurateur because like this industry, it's not as hard as everybody makes it out to be. It's not as easy, but I just
I think
put that
the
approach.
way that it's heavily regulated makes it really challenging. But the product itself and how high value it is, even in states where there are a lot of price compression, there's still, if you are efficient and a quality operator, there's a lot of meat on the bone there.
Thank you. And I'll just leave it at that because I get in trouble for saying that too often. But yes, like there is meat on the bone. And yeah,
Yeah.
to your point, 280 does exist, but every highly regulated industry has their own tax implications. Like go try and drill oil from the earth.
Yeah,
Trust me, you're gonna
exactly.
pay, yeah, some egregious, aggressive taxes as well. But anyways, I digress. So that's really interesting. And then what are your main expenses? So the revenue is going to come from, yeah, food, beverage, or product. If you can't do that, we're hosting events. And so it's going to be tickets as well as just the rental fee of the venue. But then go
Yeah.
on to the expenses. Where the large expenses live in these types of
So there's
businesses.
a couple of really big ticket items. The first one, which is more of an ongoing expense, is insurance. Because this is a little bit of a new area, it's one really difficult to find insurance providers. And then to be able to get the level of coverage that you would want to keep everyone safe and insured properly, it comes at a high price point. And so that's one of the things that I think getting into it, people need to understand. And the second one is really the build out of the space itself. Because if you're going to be consuming inside, then you need to be very vigilant about the air quality within that space, not just for the people who are there, as patrons, but as the employees. Being in that environment for an 8 hour shift, for example, and you're in a smoke dome is not safe or okay for your employees to experience. So the HVAC, the air handling that is required to be properly turning over into fresh air is really, really pricey. Not just the filtration, but the actual like turnover of the air can cost, several $1 million. And so it's really important that that is something that people are planning for, because a lot of the lounges that we have seen trying to open it, they've had difficulty with funding as they get into the build out and they realize, oh wow, this is actually going to cost a ton of money just for something you're not even going to see. It's not aesthetic, it's not adding to the vibes, it is just a safety precaution.
Well, it's not a safety precaution, it's just a price of doing business. It's like if
Yeah.
we own an extraction facility, like our pieces of equipment are not aesthetic or appealing. They're just hunks of aluminum and electricity and suction drawing through them. But it's the
Yeah,
cut price of doing business. And so if you want to own a consumption lounge, your asset is going to be your air filtration system, which to your point, it could be so much money that we have to have it like depreciated over years. So
absolutely.
yeah, so
Absolutely.
that's one of those, all right, hidden expenses. I like that. And then I guess, yeah, thinking through insurance, build out with like, yeah, air purifiers makes sense. We don't want everybody running around with a contact high. Be hard to get orders. Is there any other large expenses or just starting the lounge, things that people don't think about that normally hang them up in that getting to from pre-revenue to post-revenue or having that official launch party? Like what normally hangs
Yeah,
people up?
I think similar to dispensaries or any other cannabis facility, finding zoned properties is a big thing. And so if you're able to purchase that property that's in proper zoning, or if you have to rent that and coming to an agreement with the tenant and or the landlord and having tenant improvements and those kinds of things, those are just ongoing expenses.
And are
But
we
those are really
talking
the big ones.
is it zoned properly, meaning it needs to be zoned for hospitality or zoned for cannabis business use or both?
Both, really. That's the thing. It's because it becomes a Venn diagram of what's allowable. It has to be within the cannabis zone. It also has to be in the hospitality zone as well. So it has to be commercial. That's really difficult to find, especially in areas that you would like them to be.
So the real estate
People
team is
where they're
more.
going to feel safe walking out of your nice establishment into, a nice area as well.
And that's kind of where, like, as lounges become more of a common business model, the people that open them up will start to work with the cannabis, with the real estate people. Because essentially, what you do is you got to get your place green zoned. Ideally,
Hmm.
if the city government does it themselves, they normally don't. They're shit. And so you have to go in and like meet with them, be like, hey, this is how much money you guys can actually meet if you would green zone us for cannabis, especially cannabis hospitality. So it is unique where it's like we're just it's becoming a feel like it's a new license type, but it's growing, and so it's interesting to hear people because of course like real estate matters. People are going to go here,
Right.
so you want to be in these like kind of how there's key retail locations. There'll be key lounge areas closest to
Absolutely.
communities and
I
stuff. So
mean, I think, it's kind of not 100% talked about very openly, but a lot of cannabis and the cannabis industry as a whole is a retail or a real estate game.
yeah,
Being able to have the right properties. It's kind of like McDonald's. They're not really a burger company. They're just
no.
own a lot of great properties.
Yep. And that's the beauty too. Like once you see it as, because we just see it as licenses of real estate and capital. Like
Yeah.
you need all three to start any business. And cannabis, again, like I get in trouble for it, but it's not special. It's you get a license to do business, you get real estate to put the business at physically, and you need capital to get it going. It's
Yeah.
just it's not that special. And to do all that, sometimes you need to have a team that gets you zoned correctly. Like try doing industrial chrome. It's like it's very toxic to the environment. There's only certain cities that'll let you do industrial chrome. And I just know that example because my dad owns a factory that does that. It's like you don't just get to do this wherever. You got to get a license to do any business anywhere. Welcome to America.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. Exactly.
on that real quick, kind of moving along, I don't want this to go too much longer. Obviously, I could nerd out with you a bit longer, but 280E, does it, you get a specific cannabis license. I'm assuming 280E applies if you're for sure if you're selling product, but what if you're not selling product? So you have the state has a cannabis consumption lounge, but you're not able to sell product or food and bev. Are you still subject to 280E, do you think?
No, you're not.
Okay, so it's only if
Yeah,
you're
so it's
selling
only
product.
in the states that do allow dispensing within the lounge environment, because
That's
then you
cool.
do become essentially a plant touching business.
Yep.
But for like here in Arizona right now, actually, the way that lounges are able to operate is through that city level approval. And there
Mhm.
is no regulatory framework or code of conduct that we're adhering to. And so there is no 280E. It
It
just
makes sense
is,
because we're not trafficking any Schedule One
right.
substances. We own a piece of real estate, a box. People coming in, I don't
Yeah,
really care what they do in my box. I just want them to
right.
pay me to use it. Okay, that
Exactly.
sounded a little weird. I'll admit that. Moving
It's so
forward.
true, though. It's actually very accurate.
All right, nice. Cannabis industry going forward. Kind of where can people find you for the rest of 2024 and into 2025, and kind of what are your goals with Pause over the next 12 to 18 months?
Yeah, would love to see codified regulations here in my home state of Arizona that does allow for lounges to become an extension of the medical and adult use program here in the state. So that's something that I'm going to be working on and continue to advocate for at a regulatory level. And then, brick and mortar locations in places that allow social consumption in the right states like Nevada that do allow for dispensing that have, very positive and successful business models that are available. So that's my future plans.
Awesome, awesome. And I guess and then just taking a look at the wider cannabis industry in the United States, the global cannabis industry. What are your concerns for the future, and what are you excited about for the future?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's election season, so cannabis is a hot topic for both candidates who have positively, endorsed cannabis legalization federally. So I think we've gotten that hot and cold over the last 10 years, really. So we'll see if that really goes forward. I do have some trepidation about federal legalization. I would not want or I do not advocate for just a rescheduling of cannabis. I think descheduling is really the only way forward because it shouldn't really be a regulated substance and it should just be, managed and overseen similar to alcohol or cigarettes. And so that's what I'm hopeful for is that we will see a future that looks like that. And then we'll have oversight from the appropriate, federal institutions, whether that's the FDA or another regulatory body, that then allows for us to build up our supply chain systems to scale them into interstate and hopefully then international commerce systems.
Awesome, awesome. Man, with your background too, I feel like you really understand the impacts of interstate and then multinational supply chains. It's like, man, when we can start taking advantage of some of the arbitrage opportunities country to country, let alone, state to state, it's gonna be a whole nother new industry again. So, but it's gonna be fun,
Exactly.
while we build it to get to that point. Because I agree, rescheduling will probably happen pretty quickly here, but descheduling is what is right and where it's heading. It'll
Yeah.
just take a little bit longer, maybe, but maybe not. So, fingers
Yeah.
crossed.
I think so. I think it'll come eventually.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Allison. And it was a pleasure. You be well.
Yeah. Thank you so much.